Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Reformation, right? We left off in class talking about the early reformers, right? The early attempts, anyway, at starting a reform movement due to the corruption of the Catholic Church during the 1300s and 1400s. Again, disclaimer, right? Big disclaimer to go out there. Mr. Terry is not saying anything negative about the Catholic Church whatsoever. We are talking about, though, how corruption in the church is going to help lead to some political things that were going on at the time, right? And then, of course, Mr. Mathern and Mr. Madrano's class and your theology classes, you'll talk a lot about the Catholic Church response to that corruption and things like that with like the Council of Trent. We'll talk about that here as well, but we're going to talk about it a little bit later, okay? So let's get right back into what we were talking about with those early reformers. I'm going to clip in an old flip real quick because it's really good solid stuff, but I'll be back here in about 2 seconds to talk to you about Martin Luther. There was a lot of crazy stuff going on, y'all. A lot of crazy stuff. Now, you'd think at one point or another that they would probably inspire some early reformers, right? And that's the thing that you need to understand, is the Protestant Reformation had started long before Martin Luther ever really got the reins of it. We just consider Martin Luther to be like the stick of dynamite that, boom, blew up the entirety of the church infrastructure in general and led to the establishment of these new churches, right? But there were people that came long before him, hundreds of years before him actually, that tried to fix the church in many different ways, but their attempts just failed, right? And so that's why they're attempts, right? So the thing about it, for example, is you got this one guy named John Wycliffe, a he was middle-aged when he actually wrote this stuff down, but John Wycliffe was an English priest, right? He was an English priest that came out with a criticism of the church during the 1300s, and he believed that the church should give up all of its earthly possessions. He actually strictly abided by the Benedictine code, and he was just like, look, the church has grown too fabulously wealthy, right? It's gotten way too rich, way over the top, way grandiose, way too much. They've gained too much power and things like that. And what's going to happen is John Wycliffe is these writings of him saying that the church should give up all of its earthly possessions and commit to poverty, like St. Benedict said. They don't get discovered until after he's already dead, right? And when he's dead, he's excommunicated after he's already dead. And then they dug up his dead body and burned it and threw it in the woods, right? Because he said that the church should give up its wealth, right? Now, this sounds a little bit sketchy, but he's one of the earliest reformers to come along. And like I said, his body was dug up and burned out of spite. Now, another one that was technically the very first successful Protestant reformer, because he started the very first Protestant church long before Luther ever did, was another guy named Jan Hus, right? And Jan Hus was a Bohemian, which in the modern day era is Czech, right? Like Czech Republic, like in the Czech Republic, that's where he's from. He's the very first big reformer. He's a priest that spoke out against the immorality of the church. He said that the church had been led astray by too many corrupt leaders, too many bad leaders, and too many politicians. And he basically said in a nutshell, you know, we need to start talking about how messed up and how far away from the faith we've gotten and how we were being led by corrupt individuals and things like that. And so he began to advocate for a lot of different things. He advocated for receiving bread and wine at Mass rather than just the bread. He said that priests should be allowed to get married, and he advocated for this in the 1200s. In the Middle Ages, he advocated for this, right? That priests should be allowed to get married, that the Bible should be translated into languages that people can actually read for themselves rather than being kept in Latin, right? Which is a very big one, right? And remember that vernacular language thing is going to become very important. He also believed that we should abolish purgatory. He was just like, you know, the idea of purgatory is it's silly, right? The idea of purgatory being like this cleansing era, let's get rid of that, right? And let's just say more like you were more likely to go to heaven because of God's all-defining love, right? And then another one is he wanted to eliminate simony. He said that no one should be able to sell or profit off the selling of a church office. And he also wanted to stop any future crusades. He was just like, look, the crusades are ridiculous. Like, we can enter into an agreement with the Islamic, like, kingdoms, and we can try to, like, make it so we can actually all share the Holy Land together rather than fighting over it. Now, Jan Hus was also aware, though, of things that had happened to people like John Wycliffe, things that had happened to priests that came before him, things that are going to happen later on to other people like the Inquisition and stuff like that. So he actually went into hiding, and all the people that actually followed him were called Hussites, right? So write that down real quick. Hussites. They're going to follow him, and he's going to translate the Bible into Czech, and he's going to begin preaching to them. So technically, he's the very first successful Protestant reformer, okay? He calls those people the Hussites, and he actually says that those people are his followers, and he creates the very first successful church. So with that, he created the very first group of like Protestants, but the thing was is that they were so good about staying in hiding with him that they all kind of died out, right? And also, their leader, Jan Hus, is going to die out as well, because he's going to be summoned to this place called the Council of Constance in 1415, and he's going to try, it's the 1400s, not the 1200s. 1200s was John Wycliffe, my bad on that one. So, now look, but he's going to be summoned to the Council of Constance, right? And they write him a letter, and they tell Jan Hus, they're like, hey, man, come have a meeting with the Pope, right? Come have a meeting with the Pope, we'll talk about all your ideas, and we promise we won't hurt you. Well, what's going to happen when he gets there is he's going to be tried for heresy, he's going to be excommunicated, he's going to be put into an inquisition, he's going to be burned at the stake. And they mock him as well when they burn him at the stake, because they make for him a paper crown that puts on top of his head as the king of these fake Christians and stuff like that, and they kill him, and they burn him alive by burning him at the stake, which I don't know if you understand how painful and awful of a death that must be, but they killed this guy because he tried to start a new type of Christianity, right? So this is another big example of like that corruption in the church and stuff like that. And also, as you can see, that there are a lot of early reformers that are moving around that aren't just Martin Luther, right? Another big prominent one is going to be this guy named Desiderius Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus is a Flemish writer, which means he's Dutch, and he's going to be considered the father of Christian humanism, right? So he's going to take the elements of the Renaissance and he's going to mix them together with the ideas of Christianity. And he's going to begin to kind of ride on this idea of thinking that Christianity should be a guide to life, not necessarily just a checklist into heaven. One of the biggest things that Desiderius Erasmus wrote about that he didn't like was he didn't like the idea that the sacraments don't actually fit all individuals' lives and stuff like that. He felt that it was just you were going through this checklist and stuff like that, rather than actually proving yourself as a good human being, and that you could just easily be a bad person as long as you're hitting your checklist, you go into heaven, that it actually is not guiding you in your everyday life, right? And he also is going to be one of the very first people to come around. He's going to translate the Bible into Greek. He's going to translate it into vernacular Greek, and this is going to make a lot of people very upset. He's going to expose Catholic Church's corruption as well. He writes a book called The Praise of Folly, where he actually makes fun of Julius II, the same pope that actually paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? The same pope that did all these different things, that went to war, that died of syphilis, that did all this different stuff. And he's going to make fun of him. And he's actually going to have a drawing in there, and it's going to say that while other people are getting into heaven, Julius is going to have to sit outside while he has a list of all the wrong things that he's done, right? So he's actively making fun of the Pope that's in power at the time. An interesting thing as well is he actually met Martin Luther. Martin Luther and him knew each other in real life. And so going into it as well, though, a big thing you need to understand about Erasmus is, though, is he never stopped being Catholic, right? He never left the Catholic faith and never started a new church. But again, you've got multiple people that are pointing out the corruption that's actually going on a political level inside the church, right? Now, the thing you need to also keep understanding is that popes are going to continue to lead very wealthy lives, right? They're going to support the arts. They're going to hire artists to beautify churches. The question, though, that you need to also ask yourself is, where are they getting all this money? This thing right here, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million to pay for, right? And all of that went into Michelangelo's pocket. He also then did the Last Judgment, and he was put on retainer by Pope Paul III and stuff like that. Where is the Catholic Church getting millions of dollars for one painting in one building in the Vatican? Well, the answer to that question is a lot of different things, right? First and foremost, the rising tithe, right? They're making more money off the tithe, okay? So like as trade is returning and as the Renaissance era is boosting economics, remember the tithe is 10% of your income. It's not a flat rate. And since it's 10% of your income, that means that as more people make, the more money the church makes. And so with that, the popes are actually raking in more money. They're also going to begin to charge fees for things like baptisms and marriages and confirmations and things like that, which is going to make them money as well. But one of the big kerfuffles that goes down is in the 1400s when they begin to sell indulgences. Now, let's talk about what an indulgence is, right? You probably learned about this in class with Mr. Mathern as well. An indulgence, what it's supposed to be, is a lessening of time that the soul would have to spend in purgatory, right? And as we know already, purgatory is the Catholic belief of this place where your soul goes to be atoned, right? Now, it's kind of like the waiting room for heaven, if you will, okay? Well, the thing about it is, the question is that you have to ask yourself is, do indulgences exist in the Bible? Well, actually, the thing about it is, they do, okay? Like, in the Bible, the indulgences do exist, but they're supposed to be good deeds, right? They're supposed to be good deeds, not things you hold in your hand or things written on paper. So with that, though, what the church is going to start doing is writing them on paper, and they're going to start selling them. So the church is going to go really wayward at one point when they begin to sell these indulgences or forgiveness for sins and stuff like that, and these guarantees that you'll apparently get out of heaven sooner. Well, the problem with that is that's going to be massively unfair because it's going to basically tell rich people, live the life you want, do whatever you want, buy an indulgence, but poor people are forced to live a morally strict life because they can't afford them, right? So Martin Luther, this is going to be the thing that's going to kind of kill him in essence and kind of really be the thing that infuriates him. Well, what ends up happening is Pope Leo X, this guy right here, who was the pope that was in power when the Reformation truly began. Now, keep in mind, this whole time before this, we've just been talking about corruption that was going on in the church at the time. But Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, who's the best example of nepotism because he was from the wealthiest family in Italy and actually bought and paid his way through the ranks, he's going to begin to actually sell indulgences at a much higher rate. And he sends one priest in particular into Germany to actually, well, Germany doesn't exist in the time. It's the Holy Roman Empire. And his name was Johann Tetzel. He sends this priest named Johann Tetzel to go off and sell indulgences at a very high rate so he can use the money to start fixing up St. Peter's. He wants to use the money to actually make it even nicer, to gild some parts of it, make more art, and make it look even more beautiful. And St. Peter's is St. Peter's Basilica. These indulgences were not only going to get you out of purgatory, but could even pay off a family member that was there. And so they were even more expensive, right? And so the thing about it was there was even a pamphlet that circulated the Holy Roman Empire during the time that was printed on the printing press and was sent out all over the place. And the last line of it right here says a very famous line. And jot this down real quick. When a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, right? And so the idea was even publicized by Johann Tetzel that if you give him money, then not only you will get out of purgatory sooner, but also your dead relatives will, right? This was it and was the very last straw for a German monk by the name of Martin Luther, right? He was a young German priest who spoke out against these ideas, but no one listened to him. And one day he's going to write the 95 Theses, and he's apparently going to nail them to the door of a church, right? I have nailed in parentheses. We'll talk about that in class. But I will see y'all soon. This is y'all's flip for Thanksgiving break. Y'all enjoy your break. Have a great time with your families. We'll talk more about this when I see y'all again, okay? Y'all have a good one.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Mr. Terry, for the pass. I appreciate you actually throwing that stuff in there for me. It was very, very kind of you. But the big thing about it is we're going to pick up right where that flip was about to end and stuff like that. And we're talking now about Martin Luther, right? So the stuff that we were just talking about in that last flip with Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, a very good example of nepotism, sending Johann Tetzel out there to sell these premium indulgences that did not only get you out of purgatory, but also got your family members out of purgatory, and all that fun stuff as well, is that we have to understand that this is going to be the last straw. This is going to be the final straw that breaks the camel's back, the moment that sends a guy by the name of Martin Luther into a spiral of starting a Reformation. Now, really, really quick, before we go any further, something we need to go ahead and already throw out there is that Martin Luther never intended to start a new religion. He never intended to start a new sect of Christianity, right? He never intended to cause a schism in the church that would have reverberations for the next 500 years and even into the present day, right? We have children that literally go to Chappelle that are Lutherans, right? That are actually, of course, descendant of the followers of Luther, right? The thing about it, though, is that Martin Luther was just a young German monk, right? He was a young German priest that is going to speak out against his, speak out against this corruption. And the thing that we need to understand about, though, is, like I said, never intended to start a Reformation. He just wanted to reform and fix the Catholic Church. He just wanted to see the Catholic Church better itself. And as a young monk, you have to understand he is going to end up doing a lot of different things. Now, first and foremost, he didn't just go out one day and just decide that he was going to randomly write this document that's going to shatter the continuity of the church and stuff like that. Starting out, he actually was not even going to be a monk. He was at a very young age, he actually started to become a lawyer. His dad actually encouraged him to become a lawyer, so he goes to a university and things like that. But something we need to understand about Martin Luther in his younger life, giving the backstory to him a little bit, is that he actually was always a pretty devout Catholic, right? A very, very devout guy, very, very devout and very into his faith. And he actually went off to university to, of course, follow the offices of law. And what ended up happening to him while he was there is he gets caught in a thunderstorm. Now, funny little thing about this is he's terrified of lightning, all right? So, he's literally running from one university building to the other. And, as he's running, a huge storm crops up, and he drops down to his knees, and he freaks out and has a panic attack, and he goes, Saint Anne, if you save me from this storm, I will forever become a priest in your church. And then he just happened to not die, right? Like, so he just happened to not die from that storm and stuff like that, so he decides to go off and become a monk, right? And he doesn't just become any kind of certain time of, like, priest or monk or whatever. He actually becomes a university professor of theology and things like that while he is a priest or an actual member of the clergy. Now, something that actually does end up happening to him a lot, though, he does learn how to read, write, and translate Latin. He begins to translate a lot of the old biblical texts, and he starts to notice some inconsistencies, right? He starts to notice some inconsistencies that the way the Catholic Church is operating and the things that the Bible actually says, right? And as a young man, he decides to start writing down some of these inconsistencies. The thing about it that he, number one, though, is furious about is indulgences, right? The selling of indulgences is something that's driving him absolutely insane. Because when we look at his actual, like, things that he wrote down, he uses the word indulgence like 40-something times when he's actually, like, writing his famous document known as his 95 Thesis, right? Now, so something that you have to understand about Luther, though, he was very well traveled before he ever wrote this document. He was very, like, all over the place before he ever wrote this document. He actually met Desiderius Erasmus, like, multiple different times, and they were actually members of this thing called the Republic of Letters for a really long time. And also, he went to Rome to actually see the Vatican and meet the Pope and stuff like that. And when he was there, he was like, if hell exists, Rome is built on top of it. Because he thought it was a city for only foxes and thieves to live inside of. But the thing is he then returned back to Germany, and after that trip to Rome, after meeting Erasmus, after reading the Bible, and after hearing so much about these indulgences, he decides to sit down and he writes 95 problems that he has with the church, right? 95 issues that he's got with the Catholic Church, okay? And he decides apparently also to nail them to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, right? Like, so now, well, actually, interesting thing, it was the Holy Roman Empire at the time. It wasn't necessarily called Germany yet. Germany doesn't actually pop up until 1871, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So the thing about it, though, is he writes 95 issues down that he has with the church, and he apparently nails them to a door of a church, or excuse me, writes down 95 issues that he has with the church, and then nails them to the door of a church. Now, funny little thing about this probably never happened. One of the most big images of the Reformation, Martin Luther just tacking the 95 Theses onto the door of a church, is actually probably not realistic, right? So the reason why it, though, became such a big image and such a big deal to, like, the growth of the Reformation, the growth of all these different elements, reason why is because during, like, how many of y'all have ever been to a university campus before? And you've seen the bulletin boards and stuff like that, or the big round kiosks with all the, like, stuff posted to them or whatever? So church doors served that purpose for medieval universities and then also Renaissance universities as well. You would post announcements to them and things like that. So the image or the idea of him posting something for everyone to see and read was a really, really big deal, right? So going into it, the other thing that you need to understand is that this became, like, a very, very large image, even though, more than likely, the 95 Theses was just a letter that he wrote to an archbishop, right? But the thing that we need to understand, though, is that Martin Luther's 95 Theses are going to do a lot, right? And the key ideas of them is they disapproved of indulgences, criticized the power of the popes, and it was a call to debate. It was not a call to make a new church, right? So basically, in the 95 Theses that he sent off to the archbishop was just him saying indulgences are bad and they have no basis in the Bible to be sold, right? Criticized the power of the popes, and he also was just like, and I just want somebody to talk to me about this. And like I said, we think it was probably just a letter. More than likely, it was probably just a letter. So going into it, though, also what's going to happen after that, though, is there's going to be some infighting, okay? Like, so what's going to happen almost immediately is Martin Luther's 95 Theses are going to begin to be printed, right? Like, people are going to begin to print them and put them into pamphlet form and stuff like that. And what's going to happen, though, is that the Pope is going to hear about it, right? Leo X, the Pope at the time, is going to hear about all these copies and all these things and all this stuff that this German monk is talking about, and how he's literally saying that, oh, the church is wrong and they're doing wrong things and blah, 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 blah. And so the Pope is going to freak out about it. He's going to get really upset, and he's going to collect a bunch of copies of these pamphlets that are going out that have all of that Martin Luther's 95 Theses written all over them. And what he decides to do is he's going to, like, send Luther a letter, right? He sends him a letter known as the Golden Bull, and on that letter he says, if you don't stop doing this, and if you don't stop saying this, I'm going to excommunicate you within the next 2 months. Do you understand me? And then he took the pile of pamphlets that he had, the pile of these different, like copies of the 95 Theses, and he set them on fire, and he sent the letter to Martin Luther. Now, when Martin Luther got the letter, he had already heard about this. He had already heard about how, like, the Pope had burned all of his, like, copies of the 95 Theses, and he was actually saying that he was a heathen and he was a bad person. So what did Martin Luther do with that letter once he got it? He burned it himself, actually in front of all these people who are going to become very important. See all these different figures that are standing around him? Those people are the German princes, right? So, like, you have to understand something about the Holy Roman Empire at the time. The Holy Roman Empire was a series of different things called principalities, right? And the Holy Roman Empire, mostly the people that lived there spoke German, and most of the guys that actually like owned land there were known as German princes, right? And so the thing about it is these German princes are seeing Martin Luther openly call out the Pope and also kind of basically like taking power for himself. So these German princes are going to be intrigued by Martin Luther, and they're going to be like, I like this guy. I like the cut of his jib. I like what he's got going on over here, right? I like what he's doing because he's actually increasing his own power and authority, and maybe we should follow him, right? So the idea that he's like actually convincing these German princes is a pretty big deal. And then after that, Martin Luther's going to start writing pamphlets going against the church. And then the Pope is going to write pamphlets of his own. So a pamphlet war breaks out, right? Where literally they start going after each other. And this is a really big deal because it just demonstrates to us that Martin Luther's ideas really catalyzed because of the printing press, right? The impact of the printing press cannot be understated when talking about the Reformation. Jan Hus, John Wycliffe, Decius, well, not Decius Erasmus, he was around when the printing press existed. So like Jan Hus, John Wycliffe, those early reformers that we talked about, you could talk about this as well, Marsiglio de Padua, but y'all don't know who he is. So like the thing about it though as well, if you were talking about those guys, they were all born and they all did their work before the printing press ever even existed. And they died before the printing press ever even existed. Jan Hus burned at the stake before the printing press ever even existed, right? So the thing about it is like their ideas never got a chance to get out, but Martin Luther spread like wildfire because the printing press was a thing, right? Now the other big thing that's going to end up happening though is that Martin Luther is now excommunicated, right? He is excommunicated from the church. He is now not a part of it. He is literally not allowed to receive his sacraments and basically has been doomed to hell by like the Pope himself. Well, there's also the political element, right? Y'all, we just looked at this picture, right? It's not just people that are listening to him. The ruling powers of the Holy Roman Empire are listening to him as well. Well, speaking of the Holy Roman Empire, there's this kid that rules over the Holy Roman Empire. And I mean a kid, right? He's 19. He's only about 4 years older than most of y'all, right? And his name was Charles V, right? Now, we'll talk about Charles V a lot in a later unit, but just remember that name, Charles V. Say it in the back of your mind, Charles V. Say it with me again, Charles V, right? Charles V is a 19-year-old Holy Roman Emperor that told Martin Luther to take back the things that he said. He calls a meeting, and that meeting was called the Diet of Worms, right? And diet as in a meeting, all right? A diet is a meeting. A diet not as in he's eating them, right? And Worms because it was held in Worms, Germany. It's Worms, Holy Roman Empire. And so the thing about it, though, that we need to understand, it's not worms, it's Worms. So, like, he actually calls this meeting, and he asks Martin Luther to take back all the things he said because he wanted to prevent a war, and he wanted to prevent these princes from breaking away and starting their own, like, churches and following him instead because literally he's got a loose grip on it because he's only 19 years old, right? Like, so the thing about it, though, also is at that meeting, they actually spread all these books out in front of Martin Luther, and there were 25 different books, and they were like, "Did you write these?" And like he was just like, "Yeah, I did write those." So yeah, I did write criticisms of the church because we have gone on a wayward path. And they said, "Will you recant all the things that you have said in this, lest you be arrested and then possibly burned at the stake as a heretic?" And apparently Martin Luther freaked out about it, right? He freaked out, he went home for a day, and then he came back after freaking out, and he was like, "You know what, man? I can't do it. I can't recant because I cannot take back the things that I've said unless you can show me in the scripture where it says that I am wrong," right? Like, so yeah. So Luther, mic drop, refused to take this stuff back at the Diet of Worms. And after that, the Edict of Worms declared Luther an outlaw, and all of his writings were condemned. And they arrested him, and they were going to take him back to Wittenberg, Germany, and they were going to burn him at the stake, probably. But what ended up happening is Luther escaped, right? He escaped, and he went off and hid in a very, very famous person's castle. It's actually this guy right here, Frederick the Wise, or Frederick of Saxony, who actually hid him in this place called Marburg Castle, where he actually lived, and he actually kept Luther safe. And then this whole concept, or this whole thing, unintentionally started the faith known as Lutheranism, the first Protestant Reformation, right? And so what's going to happen is Luther is going to go on the run, and the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, like Frederick the Wise, gave him shelter. And so one of the first things he starts doing is he starts translating the Bible into vernacular languages. He starts translating it into German. But we're going to leave off right there, and we'll talk about some more stuff when I actually see y'all in class. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.